We're going to use the rest of this program talking with Stephen Cohen of the Brookings Institution. Good morning.
Good morning.
I wanted to ask you on to get a good, thorough understanding of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Why don't we begin with Afghanistan? And first of all, tell us where it is and what goes on there.
Afghanistan is a country that's about the size of Texas. It's unusual in that it's really part of three separate regions. It's part of South Asia. It's also part of Central Asia, and it's part of Southwest Asia. It has Southwest Asian links to Iran and some of the Gulf states. So it's like Burma. It's one of these countries which are in between all the other in-between regions, and it interacts culturally, politically, economically, now militarily with all of these other regions. It's always been a crossroads. Afghanistan was on the route of Alexander the Great when he left the Middle East and wound up in India. In fact, he had a terrible experience in Afghanistan on the way out, and on the way in Afghanistan, and the way out of Afghanistan. He was attacked by the Afghans, and this is a tradition of the Afghans to fight among each other, but when an invader comes in, to unite against the invader. Extremely warlike peoples, and it's the last large tribal society in the world. Afghanistan is made up of a number of large tribes. Most of them, I think 80% of them, are Pathans or Pashtuns. Pashtun and Pathan really is the same, different pronunciations of the same word. There are also other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and others, which are also organized along tribal lines. The culture of Afghanistan is tribal in that they're usually led by a clan, or the clans are led by a chief, not unlike the American Indian tribes. In our history. This makes it very hard for them to work together, to cooperate, and one of Afghanistan's historic problems has been to develop a government in the modern world. And for the most part, Afghanistan didn't have a strong central government. For a while it had a monarchy which really allowed the different tribal chiefs to run things the way they thought in the respective regions. What happened in late 1970s is that the monarchy was displaced and a republic was instituted. The republic was displaced and a communist government was put in power in 1978. And that communist government, pro-Soviet government, really itself generated a lot of resentment in Afghanistan, although it was, in our terms, a forward-looking government. But Afghanistan wasn't ready for a modern government. And the Afghan people generally rose up and with American support, with Saudi support, with Pakistani support, there began a 9-year war against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Some more facts here we can put on the screen. As you mentioned, Stephen Cohen, Afghanistan is about the size of the state of Texas. Achieved independence 1919, is that correct?
Yeah, it really was. It wasn't ever a colony. It sort of came together from different tribal regions.
Talk about the terrain here, because there are some stories in the paper today about the climate and the terrain posing a big challenge. Tell us about that.
Well, it's not impossible, but it's impassable. That is, parts of Afghanistan are level, but it's one of the most arid countries in the world. Large parts of Afghanistan are hilly and mountainous, and it's not a good area to fight in. Ironically, the Americans intelligence services have an understanding of Afghanistan because we supported the Mujahideen during the war against the Russians, and at that time developed a series of caves and hideouts and redoubts all around the country to protect the Mujahideen fighters from the Soviets.
And a little bit about the people. We understand the population's about 27 to 30 million, somewhere in that range.
But there's been an enormous death toll in Afghanistan. There's several million Afghans who are outside of Afghanistan. There, of course, there's many in the United States and the Western countries living as exiles from the country, but there's a large Afghan refugee population in Iran, and Pakistan is the world's largest recipient of refugees, as I understand.
99% Muslim, correct?
That's right.
And what's the difference between a Sunni Muslim and a Shia? Is that right?
Yeah. I think if you had to draw a simple analogy, Sunnis would be analogous to Protestants in that they're divided. They're divided into different groups and sects and so forth. Shias are more like Catholics in that there's a single Shia, I won't say church, but a single Shia belief. And the political difference is very important in that the Shias get their spiritual guidance, or their spiritual homeland is really Iran, and Iran is the most important of all the Shia countries. It is the only country that is predominantly Shia. Sunnis, and of course, Sunnis are predominant in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East.
We'll get to your calls in a couple of minutes for Stephen Cohen, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies over at Brookings. Phone numbers we'll put on the bottom of the screen for us. Once again, we split the lines geographically around the U.S., and then we have that international line on the bottom of the screen. But let's go to Pakistan for a couple minutes and learn some basic information about Pakistan. We have a new map here of Pakistan. Go ahead and tell us about this country.
Yeah, Pakistan was formed out of British India. When the British left India in 1947, they left behind two countries, India, of course, and Pakistan. Pakistan is the product of a movement of some Indian Muslims, not all Indian Muslims, but some Indian Muslims, for a separate homeland. They felt that they could not live in a Hindu-majority state, which would have been India, freely, so they decamped and created the state of Pakistan. Pakistan had originally had two important wings: West Pakistan, which is the present-day Pakistan, and East Pakistan, the present-day Bangladesh. Pakistan was the first country after World War II to be broken up in the 1971 war with India, and that led to the creation of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is also a predominantly Muslim country. It has about 10 or 15% Hindu minority. Pakistan is like 95, 98% Muslim, and that's divided between 80% Sunni, about 20% Shia.
Some more details there on Pakistan population, about 145 million people.
Right.
Yeah, and tell us more about the more modern history of Pakistan. It's hard to read a story without reading about India at the same time, right?
Yeah, Pakistan is one of these countries that has oscillated between democracy and dictatorship, usually military dictatorship, for a very, very long period of time. It's alternated between civilian governments, military governments. The present Pakistan government is a military government that took over after 9 years of rather frustrating civilian rule in the country.
Talking about Pakistan and Afghanistan, a great chance to learn a lot of detailed information from our guest, Stephen Cohen. Lancaster, California, you're up first. Hello.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
My name is Anna, and I'm from Central America. I'm from Belize.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that really got to me about it, I had no relatives, as far as I know, that was in that mess, but I do have 12 children that was born over here, and I have 12 children, grandchildren. And it really concerns me because my kids are American citizens. And first of all, I want to offer my condolences to the U.S. government and the people of the United States. But one of the things that really got to me, why was if we have all the security at the airport, why was it allowed that people can take box cutters?
Caller, thanks for the comment. We're here to talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan because we have an expert here. Any particular question about those two places?
Yes.
Go ahead.
How is it that they get past security and be able to come in this country?
She's moved back to the security issue.
Right.
I'm going to let her go and move on to Carroll, Iowa. Hello.
Hello.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Let me turn down my TV here. Okay. Is that better?
We can hear you fine.
Okay. This is more, I guess, of a religious question. How is it that, everybody keeps bringing up the idea of Muslim or the religion of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and they all came from one person, Abraham, and yet there's such division between all three of them. Somehow they're all related, and yet somehow they're all different. How can that be?
Can you speak to that, Stephen?
I can. It's a very important question. They are related, but they're related in the way that, a family that if you picture a situation where an American family exists, and their cousins and uncles and relatives and so forth, and some of them decide to convert to another religion. Perhaps they're Protestants, they decide to become Catholics, or the Catholics, they decide to become Muslims, or imagine that scenario. They are related, but they are also very different. They know each other in that they've lived with each other in an intimate family fashion, but now they're professing different faiths, and this sometimes creates hostility and strains within American families. It's also been part of the difficulty between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I don't think we should exaggerate the religious factor in these events. I think religion plays a role in it. It's an organizing principle for many of the people who've been terrorists, or they claim to be, they claim that it's an organizing principle. But their psychology of the people who perpetrated this and the people who planned it are really totalitarian. They're more like the Nazis or the fascists of Western civilization, that they have a Manichaean view of the world, black and white, good and evil. They're on the side of good, they must destroy evil. And I don't think any religion teaches that. Perverted religions may teach that, but in this case, Islam does not teach that.
How do Muslims differ in Afghanistan versus Pakistan?
I think the important thing to understand about Afghan Muslims is that they are also Pathans. That is, the culture which existed before they became Muslims is very, very powerful in their society. For example, Osama bin Laden does not want to turn, Sheikh Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, does not want to turn over Osama bin Laden. He says it would violate his code. That code is not an Islamic code. That code is from Pakhtunwala, the code of the Pashtuns. That predates rather the Islam in Afghanistan. So there's a mixture of indigenous Afghan traditions and Islam in Pakistan. Afghans are noted for their passion and their martial qualities, not for their learnedness in Islam. An important thing that's happened in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan and the rest of the world is that the clerics themselves have been phased away. There are schools and there are universities and institutions of higher education in Islam, and Egypt in particular has one of the oldest universities in the world. And these are respectable, scholarly, learned institutions. What has happened is that you now have a perverted kind of Islam, sort of a folk Islam, which is subjected to propaganda, misperception, and many of the people produced by the madrasas and these local religious schools in these countries, especially Pakistan and Afghanistan, are extremely unknowledgeable about the world. They may know the internet, but the rest of the world, they're totally clueless about.
Salt Lake City, Utah, for Stephen Cohen. The topic is Pakistan and Afghanistan. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
I'm Ratan Sharma from Salt Lake City. I have a comment. I'm so glad that the USA has finally taken the lead in bringing most of the world together in the fight against terrorism. May God help them. However, I only wish that the world community should have woken up earlier toward this threat of terrorism when these activities were actively promoted by Afghanistan and Pakistan against India and some other countries.
Stephen Cohen.
I think that's a good point, and I agree with the caller, except that in many of these disputes, I'd say in the case of Russia and the Chechens, in the case of India and Kashmir, you have a mixture of what we would call terrorism, particularly, and I would define terrorism as particularly attacks on women and children and innocents, non-combatants. You have a mixture of terrorism, which I think has been appalling, and I think the U.S. government has worked with the Indians to deal with this. But also there perhaps are grievances against the governments in these cases, which are really local issues, and America has tried to avoid getting too deeply involved in these local issues.
Give us a little bit more history on the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. When did it happen? How did it happen? What was the result, and what's the long-term implications?
It happened Christmas Eve 1979. I was flying from London to Pakistan. I heard about it in the airports along the way, and we knew that something momentous had happened. The Russians came in. Their puppet government in Afghanistan was falling. They felt they had to intervene quickly to save that puppet government. They did intervene. The result was the development of an anti-Soviet movement in Afghanistan, supported by Pakistan and the United States, and 8 years of war in Afghanistan, which wrecked the country, absolutely devastated Afghanistan. But the Russians were forced out. It was the last great battle of the Cold War, in effect. The real problem was, I think, from an American perspective, is that we got up and we left Afghanistan and Pakistan alone. We sort of pulled out. We didn't care about the region. We never organized any attempt to reconstruct Afghanistan. It may not be too late to think about doing something like that, because I think Americans in particular have an obligation to restructure the Afghan regime. Afghanistan, we can't rebuild the country, but we can certainly take the lead in providing in an international effort which would rebuild Afghanistan.
And what's the connection to what happened then to the current Taliban?
Yeah, after the Russians left, Afghanistan was ruled for a few years by a Soviet pro-Soviet leader, Najibullah, and he survived for about 2 years. He was then pushed out. He was hung and murdered. In fact, in Afghanistan, they don't push people out; they kill them. He was murdered, and then Afghanistan fell into a spell of civil war. Many of the leaders who had fought against the communist government in Kabul then fought among each other, and this went on for a number of years, 3-4 years. What happened then was that the Pakistanis and the Saudis both used this group that's called the Taliban to establish control over the rest of Afghanistan. And the American government in 1993-94 were sympathetic with the Taliban because we saw them as rather primitive and backward in that their knowledge of the world was very limited. But they were able to institute their own form of law and order on the country. They then turned out to be repressive, but from an American perspective, the worst thing they did was they allowed their country to be used as a safe haven for these terrorists, most of whom are from the Middle East and who are Arabs.
Moving on to Seattle for Stephen Cohen. Good morning.
Hi there.
Hi.
Knowing that psychology is a very important part of warfare, and we've seen a great deal of changes in our tactics in dealing with countries outside of Europe. You can't simply force Vietnam or Korea or Iraq into submission like you could European countries by breaking the backbone of their military. What do you think would be required on a psychological level? You know, what would be victory conditions for the United States inside Afghanistan, given the type of psychology that would lead people to fight to the death?
No. I think we have to make our war aims, and this is a war. We have to make our war aims very clear in Afghanistan. Victory, in a sense, is always going to be an elusive objective, but certainly our minimum goal is to rid Afghanistan or prevent Afghanistan from being a safe haven for these kinds of terrorists and organizations. It was the only major country in the world which allowed groups to come in, individuals to come in and practice military arts, to learn terrorism, to learn how to blow up buildings, blow up bridges, and also the Taliban government allowed these Arabs, and mostly Arabs, but there were others as well, to fight with the Taliban to gain military experience. And it was the only country in the world that permitted that. And I think if we can end that, that should be our first and most important objective. We're not necessarily interested in dispossessing the Taliban, and that I think would be very difficult to do. It's not a legitimate government, but it is a government, and we don't want to go to war against the Afghan people. We have to segregate or separate our war aims vis-a-vis the people who've used Afghanistan and the Afghan people themselves. If we get involved in a war against the Afghan people, we are in for a terrible, terrible ordeal. There's no question about it that this would unite the Afghan tribes against us, and it would be an endless bloody conflict. And we don't want to get involved the way the Russians got involved, or the way the British got involved in Afghanistan in 2 or 3 successive invasions. They lost most of their armies as they did that. But I think a discrete military operation which attempted to detect and eliminate those particular groups that are functioning in Afghanistan, but then also to put political pressure on the Taliban, or if necessary to eliminate the Taliban or displace the Taliban with the new government. For that we must have the assistance or cooperation of Pakistan. That's been the major political objective of the U.S. government recently in this recent diplomacy, to work with the Pakistanis to deal with the Taliban government, so they in turn would either toss out their terrorist guests who use Afghanistan as sort of a terrorist resort international, or else to displace the Taliban.
We'll go back to Pakistan specifically in a couple minutes. Let's get another call for Stephen Cohen. Another caller from Belize, Placencia. Welcome.
Yes, hello, my name is Ralph. I'm calling from Belize. I've got a question that is, I read in a German magazine, The Stern, about a month ago. A journalist, he went to Afghanistan, he did interviews with the Taliban. It says that the daughter of bin Laden is the wife of Mullah Omar. Do you have any knowledge of this? This makes actually bin Laden the father-in-law of the chief of the Taliban. Do you have any knowledge of this?
Well, it is true that there's a relationship by marriage, but at least American sources don't understand exactly what that relationship is. And that could be one reason why Mullah Omar, who's the spiritual leader of the Taliban, he doesn't live in Kabul, he lives in Kandahar, which is the heartland of the Taliban. That may be one reason why he's so protective of bin Laden. I think even also important, you have to recognize that there's a symbiotic relationship between the Taliban and various groups, especially Al-Qaeda, that have set up shop in their country. The Taliban provide Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden with a physical space in which to operate. Al-Qaeda has provided military support for the Taliban, technical support for the Taliban, possibly financial support for the Taliban. The Taliban receive primary support from Pakistan, economic aid and so forth, also from some of the other Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates, which has just broken off with relations with them. But they receive specific technical and military support from Al-Qaeda and from Osama, and that's been why they've been so tightly bound together.
Have you been to Afghanistan?
I've been on the border of Afghanistan.
What does it look like when you're looking into it?
I got up to the border and I was going to go there, and there was a coup in Afghanistan, so I didn't go in. But I've been in parts of Pakistan and along the borders with Afghanistan. I'd say it resembles Texas, only much tougher terrain, more like Arizona, parts around the Grand Canyon. We have mountain peaks of 6,000 to 10,000 feet. There's no water there at all. It's a completely arid country. For a military operation in Afghanistan, it's almost inconceivable. The last time I was on the border in the Khyber Pass, we saw refugees streaming out of Kabul to Pakistan, fleeing, in a sense, the Taliban and some of the groups that were attacking Kabul. Then we saw other refugees leaving Pakistan, going back into Afghanistan. It was a two-way flow of refugees. The Pakistanis are very, very concerned that they might be flooded with a few million Afghan refugees, and this has tremendous implications for Pakistan. In all of this, I think the consequences for Pakistan may be as important as the consequences for Afghanistan.
Boston for Stephen Cohen. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Rose, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I have a basic comment. I see your maps, and I hear about different religions, and basically my problem is the fact that I now am in need of understanding a religion that I've never needed to know anything about, an area I don't know anything about, and more importantly than anything, words and a language that I know nothing about. And when I hear Mr. Cohen talking about all of this, the thought comes across, how do I get a crash course unless you're doing this for an hour? But where do we go now to understand what we need to understand in order to understand what our government's going to do?
Thanks, Stephen Cohen.
Good question. Let me say that I was a professor for 34 years at a University of Illinois, and I taught this area. I taught international politics. And what I noticed over 34 years, and what I noticed in Washington, is that the knowledge of Americans about the rest of the world, not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, has really described a downward curve. We don't teach geography, we don't teach history, we teach a lot of trendy subjects which are nice, but we don't teach the basics. And I sympathize with the caller in that it's our education is fundamentally not good. I've had calls from journalists who don't know the difference between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they call them all the stands, and there's Uzbekistan and so forth. So I think that the best place to start would be some of the major American newspapers who've been publishing sort of brush-up courses on the region, sort of backgrounders for their readers. There are a number of good books. I can't go through them now, but a number of good books on Islam. There's a friend of mine at an American university called Akbar Ahmed, who's written a magnificent book on the history of Islam and the Islamic peoples, and I think those would be good places to start. But your library and your bookstores will undoubtedly have plenty of things on display. But I think the fundamental problem has been, while we are people who are made up of peoples from around the world, our own educational system does not provide the kind of background and depth of understanding that is necessary.
A little bit more than a half hour left with our guest Stephen Cohen, who is Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, has either co-authored or edited several books, including The Pakistan Army and South Asia After the Cold War, an International Perspective. And we have a call from San Diego. Hello.
Good morning. Mr. Cohen, do you and other scholars like you, are you taking an active part in the formulation of our country's plans for the invasion and the handling of this current situation?
Thanks.
Put it this way, I try to be as helpful as I can to friends of mine who are in the U.S. government. There's been some interest on their part in consulting with a wide variety of people, scholars and others about these issues. And of course my publications are out there for them to see. I spent 2 years in the State Department in the policy planning staff, and one thing I did learn is that once you go in the government, you're sort of impervious to outside information. You either think you know it all and don't want to ask for information, or else you're so busy that you don't have time to get information or advice from outsiders. But I think this is going to be a long, drawn-out crisis or series of crises, and I'm sure they will be consulting fairly widely with outsiders. What I've tried to do is put my writings and publications on the Brookings website, and Brookings itself has begun a study group, an analysis group. It's called the Brookings Project on Terrorism and American Foreign Policy, and www.brook.edu on Monday we'll get you to our page where my writings, the writings of my colleagues and scholars, Jim Steinberg, our director, Jim Lindsay, who's managing this project, they'll all be up on the website. And what we're trying to do is offer a primer for people who have access to the web on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also frequently asked questions. What are the major questions that people are asking? We're going to try and put those up there as well.
Talk to us a little bit more, Stephen Cohen, about the political situation inside Pakistan. The General Musharraf said the other day that if he doesn't help the U.S., India might take advantage of the situation. What do you mean by that?
Well, he's right in that, and I think he had a historical choice to make, and he made it. Of course, that he may change his mind later, but right now he seems to be willing to work with the United States, offering support, military and political support. And the most important thing I think that Pakistan can do would be to put pressure on the Taliban. And if that doesn't work, if the Taliban insist on harboring these people, then to work with the United States in establishing a larger framework for Afghanistan. He's in a very difficult position. He's a general, and he's made himself president, and he heads the army. But this action will be somewhat unpopular in Pakistan. Pakistan is a major country, 140 plus million people, which is undergoing a tremendous political stresses. Democracy hasn't worked in Pakistan. The economy has failed in Pakistan. The military are governing in Pakistan, but they don't like it. They see Afghanistan as important to them, not in terms of religious purposes, but for strategic purposes, primarily because they're concerned that India might establish a foothold in Afghanistan surrounding Pakistan. If you look at a map, you see India on one side, Afghanistan on the other. The Pakistani military see this in a strategic sense, and they do want to have a neutral or a friendly Afghanistan. They don't want to see Indian or Russian influence grow in Afghanistan.
You mentioned earlier in the week at a discussion that this is sort of like the Middle East, but with nuclear weapons.
That's right. That's right.
Tell us more.
Well, you have a long-standing rivalry between India and Pakistan. I won't say this is eternal or deep-rooted. It's deep-rooted, but I think there are ways of resolving this, although that will take time. But India and Pakistan are nuclear weapon states. Their rivalry is analogous to that between the Israelis and the Palestinians and some of the Arab countries. And that is, it cannot be solved overnight. It takes long diplomacy, patience, change in attitudes, and so forth, which would bring about at least a normalization of the situation. The primary focus of their dispute is Kashmir. The Indians claim that it's theirs. The Pakistanis would like to see Kashmir have some kind of plebiscite or determination of autonomy. And they've been unable to agree on even a process to discuss the Kashmir problem. There was some progress earlier this year at Agra, where there was a summit between President Musharraf and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And the Indians of all the countries are the most concerned about what might happen in Pakistan. A Pakistan that deteriorated or collapsed or lapsed into Islamic extremism would be catastrophic for India, because India itself has about 120 million Muslims. It's one of the world's largest Muslim populations.
Let's go to San Jose, California, for Stephen Cohen. Good morning.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. Between India and Pakistan, before all this happened, America was beginning to tilt in favor of India, which I thought was a very dangerous move, because Pakistan has been an American ally for 50 years. In previous calls, I have made the proposal for a solution in Kashmir, which is rather simple, where basically both parties agree that for 5 years there is no solution and the ownership is unclear. But both parties withdraw their militaries, and a person of Mr. Carter or Mr. Bush, the father's stature, basically goes there and urges or forces both the countries to have a combined civil administration, where a Pakistani SP and an American deputy commissioner, or an Indian deputy commissioner, and a Pakistani chief minister and an Indian governor share the responsibilities, and basically develop the state as a commercial venue. And America, all parties will be benefited by a situation like this. And I have one other comment to make with respect to the war that we are taking against terrorism. Mr. Hart and Mr. Rudman had recently had a commission out whose reports were basically ignored when they first came out. But the point there is that a lot of these terrorists are kind of Frankensteins of our own previous policies, which basically didn't support the people but supported the regimes. And the countries that we are in alliance with, mainly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, have got the governments that haven't changed in years. And mostly all the aid that we put in goes to graft and corrupt officials. And America has to seriously look into the fact that our help goes to the betterment of the people in these countries rather than the people that we dole out the aid to.
Thank you, Stephen Cohen.
Let me take your last point very briefly, and let me say that I agree with you. I think that our so-called moderate Arab allies are also part of the problem. While they're not radical and they're not anti-American officially, they have tolerated a lot of propaganda, both in the Middle East, on the Middle East case against Israel and others, and they have funded anti-American and also anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish for that matter, and anti-Christian propaganda elsewhere. When you go to Pakistan, you see slogans on the walls, both in English and in Urdu. You know, death to the Jews, down with Israel, et cetera, you know, down with America. A lot of this propaganda is funded or inspired by groups that are based in the Middle East. Pakistanis, for example, are very moderate people, but I think that they've been exposed to a lot of virulent propaganda for many years, and the Pakistan government has tolerated it. It hasn't done it itself, but it has tolerated this kind of propaganda. Let me get to your question about India, Pakistan. So I think there's two important things to say about this danger spot, and it could turn out to be, in terms of global problems, far more serious than anything we've seen in the past few years. India and Pakistan each have a sense that they are threatened by the other side. The Indians believe that there's been a large alliance with Pakistan, China, and the United States and the Islamic world against India. So India has the psychology of a threatened minority state. The Pakistanis look around and they see that they are the smaller state, that India is trying to wipe them out and eliminate them. There are people in both countries, in fact, who feel that the other state does not deserve to exist or is not a viable state. I've talked to Indians who feel that Pakistan is a temporary phenomenon that will go away. I've talked to Pakistani radicals, extremists, I think, who deride India as an impossible state also. And these are the kinds of people with this kind of psychology that have blocked the kind of solution that you have proposed, that is some kind of compromise working or agreement which would lead to a standstill for several years. On both sides, you get people who are either fearful but also hateful. And it's very difficult for them. It's easy for them to block a dialogue. It's hard for a peace process to get started in South Asia. And I think the United States should play a behind-the-scenes but still important role in bridging this gap.
A story from the AP this morning. A Taliban official in Afghanistan says the militia shot down an unmanned spy plane of unknown origin this morning. Heavy fighting is reported between the Taliban and its primary opposition in the northern part of the country where the plane was shot down. Tell us more about this opposition to the Taliban.
Yeah, the Northern Alliance is primarily based on Uzbek tribals. There's some Pathan groups involved with them. They claim to have widespread support in Afghanistan. I've never been up there myself, but I have friends who have been up there and talked to the leadership. They could present. They're not a viable government for Afghanistan themselves, but they could be part of a package that the Americans may well put together, which would consist of dissident Taliban elements, that is, the elements that are not under the influence of the Arab groups, other Pathan tribes. Some of them are connected to Pakistan, and presumably Pakistan would have to play a role in this. So you could see a coalition arising with perhaps limited American support that could defeat the Taliban militarily and replace it with some kind of larger government. That government, in turn, might receive significant economic aid from the United Nations, from a whole host of other countries that would like to see Pakistan reconstructed. A necessary condition in this is Pakistan's consent, because Pakistan provides physical access to Afghanistan. And I think also the Iranians would want to be part of this process, because the Iranians have vital strategic interests in what goes on in Afghanistan.
Newark, Delaware, for Stephen Cohen. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
My mind turns in two directions, really, listening to the national discussion of the religious underpinnings of the terrorist actions. Back in the 80s, Central America, we had a lot of people in Christian or Catholic religion following the theology of liberation. And so I'm just concerned about, like, how does a person turn from that support against the religious underpinnings of what's been happening, granted that it's, outrageously beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And then my mind also, I've thought of the IRA and what has the United States put itself in a position to do in the future if we're saying that under NATO, that when one country is attacked, that the others must respond.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me say that these groups are the groups who carried out this attack are not motivated by religion as such, because Islam does not approve of such actions. Islam has its hard side, its militant side. There is a jihad in Islam. But Islam is primarily a religion that does not practice or does not encourage the practice of anything remotely resembling what happened. And I think Muslims around the world have come out and said this, and Muslim clerics around the world have been quite clear that this is not part of Islam at all. I think the root, there are many causes, many reasons why this has happened. The leaders of some countries have tolerated radical groups to flourish in them, terrorist groups to flourish in their countries. I'd say that this has certainly been true of Afghanistan, but the Iraqis, the Syrians, perhaps the Iranians have played around with these groups. Their intelligence services have allowed them to function, have supported them, and there may be a wider network of people involved, although the number of people involved is actually not overwhelming, maybe in the thousands, but certainly not the tens of thousands. I think the root cause of why a young man goes and gives his life to, in a car bomb or some other bombing, commits suicide, is partly social in that these societies have a lot of dislocated people, partly ideological in that some of them have the analogy here would be that of Americans who've been love bombed by a cult, and to some degree I think we'll find out that some of the people who've been brought into these attacks were really brainwashed and turned into a cult. The rationalization for this is religion. The rationalization is that the world is divided between good and evil. America stands for evil. Islam stands for good. They're fighting in the cause of Islam and Islamic peoples. But again, no respected Muslim leader anywhere in the world would subscribe to them.
Touch on some of the other countries here, if you could. We talked about Pakistan and India. You mentioned Iran in your last statement. There's also a border with China and several of the former Soviet republics, as we touched upon, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and others.
Yeah, the Chinese are very concerned about this development. The Chinese have a large Muslim population in far western China. We're very familiar with the Chinese concern about Tibetans, and there's been a lot of popular American support for the Tibetans and for what many Americans regard as Chinese oppression of Tibetans. But the Chinese are actually more worried about their Muslim population, the Uyghurs and other groups in the far west, who've been proselytized by some groups that have come from Afghanistan and Pakistan, missionaries preaching Islamic separatism, Islamic extremism, or that the Chinese Muslims should join the larger Islamic community and join the Ummah. I think that the Chinese will be supportive of any action the Americans take. And that's one reason why in Bush's speech, when he listed the totalitarian groups of the world, he talked about fascism, Nazism. He didn't talk about communism because he didn't want to alienate the Chinese. These are the kinds of compromises that American policymakers are going to have to be making. That is, if we want Chinese cooperation, we cannot simply stand up and criticize China. We're going to have to shade our criticisms of China and other countries if we want to get them to work with us. In the case of Iran, the Iranians are, of course, the center of Shia culture and the Shia branch of Islam. That is a branch of Islam which more resembles an organized church than Sunni Islam. And the Iranians have ties of culture and language in Afghanistan. In fact, the Taliban targeted many Shia Muslims in Afghanistan who were Pathans, but targeted them. And I think that the Iranians, but the Iranians have played a double game with the Taliban. On the one hand, they've supported opposition groups, the Northern Alliance. On the other hand, they've developed a working relationship with the Taliban. The former Soviet republics to the north, their interests are mixed. They might serve as a base of operations for the United States should we have military operations in Afghanistan. And some of them are also concerned about the growth of radical Islamic movements in their countries.
And there's this piece out of Moscow in the Washington Post today. Putin says U.S. and Russia won't haggle over terror. President Putin ruled out any haggling with the U.S. over Russia's cooperation in efforts to battle terrorists, saying support for retaliatory strikes was not contingent on the U.S. backing away from its planned missile defense system.
Yeah. I think that what's happened in American policy is that this concern with terror and fighting terrorist attacks on the United States has lowered temporarily a number of other important interests, such as the ABM, our concern with China, our rival with China. You can go down the list and you could see the number of issues and concerns that are now being given less support. I think it's important from a policy perspective to wait a few weeks, maybe even a few months, to see which issues will come back. We will give terrorism or anti-terrorism, counterterrorism a much higher profile in the list of hierarchy of our interests, but other interests will emerge. There'll be another crisis, for example, and we'll wonder why we ignored those issues. So I think that if you take the long run, a year or so, terrorism will find its proper role, or a more balanced role in the list of our priorities. It will be much higher than it was before, but I think that other issues will reassert themselves.
Springfield, Illinois, for Stephen Cohen. Good morning.
Yes, hello. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank you. You've been very informative. One question I do have about Islamic culture, Islamic history. I bothered to look up the word assassin, and it seems that it's directly linked with Islamic culture. I wonder if you can give me a brief overview of the assassin state or the assassin mentality that, historically speaking, led to organized terror as a form of political control.
Yeah, the word assassin is related to the word hashish, and the original historical inference is that the assassins were under influence of drugs or narcotics when they carried out their attacks or their murdering other officials. I wouldn't say this is Islamic in any sense. If you read any good history of Rome or even of Greece, you'll see assassins popping up all over the place. I mean, this is the kind of activity which is common to all cultures. Chinese culture, Indian culture. People have been assassinating each other for a very long time. And so I don't think the notion of an assassin should be tied particularly to Islam. But the word itself does derive, I think, from Arabic, if I recall.
Orinda, California. Hello.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I've been a fan of Mr. Cohen's scholarship for a long time. The question I have is that many of these tribal groups are founded on a precept of revenge and cycles of retribution. I wonder what the U.S. can do that doesn't just put us into just another cycle.
Yeah, it's essential that the United States do two things. First of all, that it makes the evidence clear as to why we're going after Osama bin Laden. This is what the Taliban have been asking for. We've showed them evidence, in fact. They've said this isn't good enough for them. But I think President Bush has to make a determination that it's worth perhaps compromising some of our intelligence sources to provide this information to the public. That's essential, not only, I won't say for the Taliban so much, because they may be history by the end of this month or next month, but it's important in order to maintain a coalition that it be demonstrated clearly that we have good evidence on Osama bin Laden. He was, after all, indicted in an American court earlier, so I think the evidence is there, but it has to be presented in a clear, persuasive fashion, and it's my understanding that the evidence is there. He's got to make the decision to make it public. The speech he gave, which was a magnificent speech, did not talk about the evidence, and I think he's going to have to do that. The other aspect of your question was what?
Paul, are you still there? I didn't write it down. Yeah. I apologize to the caller. Back to the Taliban for a quick sec, and the possibility of immediate fighting. Taliban has an army, what we would call an army. How large is it?
Oh, it's several thousand men, maybe. I haven't seen any good current estimates, but I think some of them would melt away. They're not well equipped. The Pakistanis presumably will be turning off fuel and oil supplies so that the few Taliban tanks won't be able to run. That's not the problem. The problem is, I remember the other part of the question. The problem is that we don't want to take on the Taliban in the shape of Afghans. We want to have Afghans fighting Afghans in this case, and presumably the emergence of a coherent government when all of this is over. If we go into Afghanistan, and if it's perceived by the Afghans that we're fighting the Afghan people, then we're in for a terrible, terrible struggle. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that with the support of Pakistan, hopefully Iran and some of the northern former Soviet republics in the north, that this is an international effort, that other important Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt are with us on this. They're providing logistics support, perhaps intelligence support, maybe even a few token military units, and that we're not fighting the Afghan people, that we're trying to relieve the Afghan people of a terrible burden which has been the Taliban government.
What do you make of the news out of Saudi Arabia here in the Post? Saudis balk at U.S. use of key facility. They're resisting the U.S. request to use a new command center on a Saudi military base in any air war, forcing Pentagon planners to consider alternatives that could delay a campaign for weeks.
Often there's news behind the news, and I don't know that in this case, but I would be very disturbed if that seems to be the Saudi attitude. The Saudis have to visibly cooperate with us, and they have to do as much as they can. But they're the kind of regime that has been reluctant. They do things their own way. There's a Saudi way of doing things, and they think that's the right way. But I think in this case, we've got to tell our friends, our so-called friends, that this is a matter of vital importance to us. And they're dependent on the United States in many ways. They're dependent on the U.S. for military protection. And I think that in the end they will have to come through with assistance for us. The form of that assistance, the shape of it, I don't know, but certainly public statements to that effect are essential.
Let's get to a call from Panama City, Florida. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Because the people are suffering under the oppressive dictatorship, do you think we should garner support from the people by providing food and medicine and maybe establishing some broadcasting to tell people the truth while we're over there?
Yeah. You're referring to Afghanistan?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of all over the Middle East while we're over there, sort of let people know we're on a peace mission instead of...
Two things. I'm afraid that broadcasting won't do it. You need to have the cooperation of regional governments, because in their schools, in their local television broadcasts and so forth, and certainly privately, you get the circulation of terribly virulent material, not only anti-American but anti-Israeli, anti-Christian, anti-Indian, you name it, and it's there. These are not modern regimes in the sense of being liberal Western democracies. I don't think we can, or I don't think we should attempt to overthrow them. There are a few regimes, though, which certainly have actively worked against American interests, and I put Iraq at the top of that list. I think that President Bush's father was remiss when he had the opportunity in not removing the Iraqi Saddam Hussein in 1991. I think, but you don't take on a country like Iraq quickly. This is a long haul, and I think that we should be building up the opposition to Iraq. We should be working on radio broadcast, propaganda, and so forth to deal, to counter Saddam Hussein's rule. But that is a very, very long road.
We have a caller from Jerusalem this morning. Hello.
Yes, hello. How are you?
Doing fine.
That's good. I wanted to let you know these covert operations and the same thing that happens in Israel with the Palestinians, discriminating the Palestinians. What is there any hope for moderate to radical to what is a hope for people that are more fundamental? Some are moderate, some are this, some are that. What is the aspect for that kind of stuff? And if there is, I believe there is a hope for Islam. Islam came not for 2,000 years ago, but from much later age than Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah. No, I think that it's my belief that almost all Muslims that I know, and I know a good number of them, mostly Pakistanis, of course some Indian Muslims and a few Afghan Muslims, these are moderate, sensible people who do not practice or believe in any kind of extremism whatsoever. They may have policy differences with the United States on a range of issues, but they're willing to sit down, they're willing to argue, they're willing to discuss, and that's the beginning and the end of it. There is a small tiny minority in any country, whether it's a Christian country, whether it's a Jewish country, Israel, whether it's a Buddhist country, Sri Lanka, whether it's you name it, there's a small tiny minority that has a totalitarian mentality. These are not people you can usually deal with or reason with. The problem is that they have been given shelter, encouragement, they've been praised in a number of countries, and right now in the Middle East and parts of South Asia, they're held up as heroes by either the governments or by the religious leaders. And I think that that is an area where America can have some influence, where public information programs, dialogues, and so forth would be useful. But above all, in a sense, the educational systems of these countries have been turning out, I'd say, ignorant and biased and uninformed people. They know all of our faults, but they don't know any of our virtues. Yet many of them would like to migrate here. And an interesting phenomenon is that many people from some of these countries come to the United States, and they still don't understand America. And it takes a long time for them to understand our complexity and our diversity. I think the bottom line is that America rests on the principles of cooperation, dialogue, normalization, normal relations. And when we see somebody we don't like, instead of hitting them or yelling at them, we should try to undertake a dialogue with them. There are cases where there are people who we may not like us, who've declared war on us. I don't think dialogue is appropriate at that time. So I think then force or other means are necessary.
You talk about information, Stephen Cohen. Does the internet play a role at all in this?
Internet plays a role, but it's both good and bad. On balance, I think it's for the good. But some of these groups, some of these Islamic extremist groups, and also I'd say some Christian extremist groups, Jewish extremist groups, Hindu extremist groups have used the internet to organize and to develop relations among themselves, and they spew out on the internet vast amounts of misinformation. But the internet can be used to bring people together and share ideas if people would like to have decent, civilized solutions to a lot of these problems.
Email with a simple question here about Afghanistan. Where do they get their water from?
The traditional Afghan system consisted of a series of underground wells and traps and canals that would conserve whatever small water did fall in Afghanistan and shelter it so it wouldn't evaporate. So in many parts of Afghanistan, there were long canal systems, underground canal systems. The water would literally run in a canal that was covered by stones and rocks. These systems have been destroyed. And one of the major problems for Afghanistan is to rebuild and reconstruct the traditional agricultural system, which was based on these water supplies. There's famine in Afghanistan right now, quite independent of the wars that have been going on. And America has been the largest provider of food assistance for the Taliban for the past 6 or 7 years.
Also read in the CIA World Fact book that both countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, produce quite a bit of opium and hashish. Tell us about that.
The narcotics produced in Pakistan have gone into decline. The Pakistan government has had a program of eliminating, eradicating growth of poppies there. The Taliban agreed to terminate poppy production, and there's evidence of the past year or so that they did stop growing poppies. And therefore opium and heroin from the poppies. But there are apparently several tons of this stuff in storage, and the question is whether this planting season they will allow or they will not allow poppies to grow. One of their complaints against the West and against the outside world has been that they have not been rewarded for stopping the growth of opium, of poppies, which produces.
Danville, California.
Yes, what about just total economic isolation of Afghanistan?
Yeah, Afghanistan is already under sanction, and it is as economically isolated as any country can be. We have provided food aid for Afghanistan for humanitarian reasons, but other forms of goods and transport have not gotten in, are technically banned from Afghanistan. But Afghanistan has a long porous border with Pakistan, a long border with Iran. There's a smaller border in the north with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and a tiny border with China. It's my understanding that while the Pakistanis have shut off some supplies to Afghanistan, that some of this leaks through Iran. And you have to remember, this is the heart of the smuggling zone. And people have been smuggling things through these countries for thousands of years, and I don't think that any official ban can stop it. You'd need to have, no army, in fact, could prevent smuggling from going on.
I was going to ask if the army could prevent...
No.
No?
No, we can't prevent smuggling of people across the border with Mexico. And this is terrain, this is a border that's 10 or 15 times the size, much more difficult terrain to operate from.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Yes. I just have one question. I've been reading various newspapers that indicate that the root cause of these terrorist attacks in America were the American policy in the Middle East, such as the the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What do you think about that?
I just disagree completely. Times, I think that makes it quite clear that the people who've done this attack don't hate America, and they don't hate our policies. They hate Americanism. They're worried about freedom, and they're worried about liberty. And to them, we're seen as a unstructured, loose, and dangerous society, which can only be eradicated and punished, or punished and hopefully eradicated. They're not. If we changed our Middle East policy tomorrow, they would still be doing the same things. They hate us for what we are, not for this policy or that policy. They're also unwilling to sit around a table and say, well, what should we do here about Kashmir, or there about Kosovo, or there about the Middle East, the Arab Palestinian problem. So I think that they have gone over the edge in terms of their pathological hatred towards the United States. That's the bad news. The good news is that there aren't many of them. There's not thousands of people around the world. The core people we have to worry about, which is one reason why this war on terrorism is not an open-ended struggle. The core numbers are very, very small. But I think to get at them, to reach them, well, I don't think you can get at them or reach them. What you can do is try to prevent a new generation of people from following in their footsteps. It turns out that many of the individuals involved in these operations were alumni or graduates of the Afghan War from 1980 to 1988, and these were mostly Arabs who came to Afghanistan, fought against the Russians, thought they were great heroes, went back to their societies, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and expected to receive a hero's welcome in their countries. You know, nobody was interested in them when they went back, and Osama bin Laden recruited them and has built his support on these war veterans of Afghanistan. Ironically, they're in some sense our product, because we did encourage them and support them in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Again, I would say that our failure to address the Afghan problem in 1989, 1990, when the Soviets left, was a major policy failure on our part. We were involved at the end of the Cold War. We were involved with the war against Saddam Hussein, and we sort of put Afghanistan on the back burner, couldn't care less about it.
And are other parts of the world as concerned as the U.S. is right now about this kind of action, this kind of terrorism?
I think
from these people, I mean.
Yeah, I think that many countries have been subjected to terrorist attacks by these groups. India in particular. India has been the target of more terrorist attacks than perhaps any other country in the world. Some of these terrorist attacks in India, or use of violence, the people, let me say, the people who perpetrate these things don't regard themselves as terrorists. They regard themselves as freedom fighters. In some cases, they may have legitimate grievances, or grievances which verge on the legitimate. They should perhaps be using peaceful means, but they've made their choice. In other cases, I think they've come as visitors to a foreign country, and they're interested in a holy crusade. India in particular has been subject to a lot of these groups, and their interest is not in Kashmir, which is the dispute between India and Pakistan. They're interested in a much larger ideological transformation of India, and their target is the 120 million Indian Muslims. And one of the terrible things of this crisis is that it could spread to India and Pakistan, and the goal of the terrorists is not simply to destabilize, not simply to get Kashmir, but to turn this into a holy war and unite the Indian Muslims, which are 120 million people, and then move on to Bangladesh, another 140 million people. And so I think that their goals are vast and enormous, but fortunately, as in the case of some of these groups, and historically, the means by which they can carry them out are not that they can be countered, I think.
Last call for this segment, and then we'll hear the President's radio address. Irvine, California. You're on with Stephen Cohen.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh.
Yes, my name is Mike. I'm calling from Irvine, California. How are you guys? Hello.
Yes, thank you for calling.
Okay. I just wanted to let you know there is two good movies one has been made by Anthony Quinn. It's called The Messenger. I do not know if you know it or not, which is, I can give you the phone number of people if they want to know about Islam. It's 213-384-5983.
Okay.
Or if you
what's the other movie?
The other movie is called Islam, which is on pbs.org.
Right.
That will tell you about Islam.
Right.
The second thing, personally myself, I think that the U.S. government and American people, we should wish democracy and freedom for everybody in the world, because no blood is any different than any blood. We should bring a policy that will help everybody in the world.
All right, thank you. Final thought from Stephen Cohen.
Well, I'd only summarize by saying that this has taken us all by terrible surprise. We are now galvanized for a war against terrorism, but this is going to be, as the President has said, this is going to be a long and difficult war. The people who support terrorists are as much the target as the terrorists themselves. We will have a lot of allies around the world in this struggle, but we don't want to let this become a national obsession, because there are other important American interests out there, and we have to find a compromise, or we have to be able to balance our new struggle against these kinds of terrorist threats and our other important interests around the world.
Stephen Cohen of the Brookings Institution, thanks as always for your time.
Good to be with you.
A couple program notes here on C-SPAN tomorrow. We're going to talk with Jonathan Tucker, author of Scourge. It's on the threat of bioterrorism. Also journalist from Egypt and Russia on international reaction to all of this today.